Hello everybody and welcome to episode number 10 of Jan's Opening Clinic, the very exciting show format where the Chess24 premium users can ask me questions about chess openings in a news article we normally publish 1 or 2 days before that, and then I'm gonna give my answers, sometimes expertly, sometimes in a more condescending tone, depending on my mood. So far I'm in a good mood today, even though my tie doesn't really stick to the place where it's supposed to, but that could change any second. Apologies in advance should I not get to all of your questions. I'm on a bit of a budget here time-wise. I have like 90, maybe 100 minutes and we have a lot of questions, so let's not waste any time and jump right into the action, if this works. Also apologies that I can't answer questions that occur in the chat or follow the chat that much, because I have to focus on all these opening positions you guys are asking me about. So let's get started with Mr. Bluesy. He's saying, "Hi Jan, I play Sicilian as black, but when white answer with a closed Sicilian, I have troubles finding plans other than progress on the queen side with randomly pushing pawns. Sounds like a plan to me, but white is coming at my king faster. Is there a safe way to deal with white attempts to checkmate? If not, can you give what you think are the best ideas for black?" Bit too general a question for my blood, but I will try to say something useful. I have to switch windows here, so this is a very challenging task. Let's see. So the closed Sicilian, e4, c5, knight c3. First of all, your move here should depend on your repertoire. If you're a knight-off player, then you have a problem going knight c6, because white could trick you going knight f3 and then follow up with d4 when you don't reach your beloved knight-off. So the position you posted would occur via knight-off move or against a knight-off player because the pawn was already on d6. Well, if you don't have to go d6, if you're, let's say, a Taimanov player, you can go for this, and here black is in no hurry to play d6, so after bishop c4, e6, you can go knight e7 and then d5 in one go, and this is supposed to be very, very comfortable for black. Well, if you're a knight-off or dragon player, you have to do something else here. You have a choice between d6 and a6, which many knight-off players do, which is quite interesting in order to go b5 very quickly. But I'm gonna assume you want to stick with this move order. Go d6, f4, knight to c6. Give me 1 second here. Knight to f3, g6, bishop c4, bishop to g7, short castles, and e6. This is the most dangerous version of this stuff that white can get, because black is already committed to d6. I am not a tremendous expert here. I know that you're supposed to wait a little with castles in order not to get checkmated. Normally they play queen e1, tending queen h4, and after castles, as far as I know, f5 is kind of dangerous. So I believe you're supposed to go h6 here when f5 loses a lot of its bite, because there's no king to checkmate and you can just take here and then take it from there. Well, if white doesn't go f5, if he goes queen h4, for example, the queen doesn't really do all that much as long as black hasn't castled, and black can start the randomly pushing pawns on the queen side playing. Go a6, b5, go after this bishop with knight a5 or knight d4. And as far as I know, black is supposed to have pretty comfortable play. So my two main points, I guess, are if you can avoid it, if your repertoire allows you to, then don't go d6 so early, because without d6 all these lines are easy. And if you're a knight-off player, think about a6 here. I believe that's what Niklas, for example, recommended in one of his video series. Well, if you do end up in this position, don't castle so early and get checkmated after f5, but wait a bit with castles, play this h6 directed against white's attack, and take it from there. Hope that helps a little bit. Let's get to the next question by Mr. Let's Beast. What's Let's Beast saying? He is saying, "Hey Jan, I saw a lot of the 6h3 variation in the knight-off at top level. Is it called the Anand variation by now? I don't think it's called the Anand variation, but all the strong guys are using it, so yeah. Call it whatever you like. Could you point out the ideas for white and maybe guess why it is so popular at the moment? Thanks and keep up the good work. Thank you." I can guess, and yeah, I have my theories. The main reason is people don't know what to do against the knight off. It's a very good opening, and white's resources are sort of exhausted in many of the lines, or they're stuck in many of the main lines, like bishop e3 and bishop g5 and whatnot. So let's put it on the board. The good old knight off. It's very hard to play line here. Bishop e3 used to be popular, but knight g4 is doing amazingly well. Bishop g5 is a mess, but theoretically black tends to be fine in all the lines as far as I know. Bishop c4 is sort of dead, so there's not that much choice. Some guys play the positional lines with bishop e2 or with g3, but people who want a sharper game, they tend to go for h3 nowadays, preparing g4. And practice has shown that after e6, g4, white is doing pretty well. d5 doesn't fully equalize. Knight ft7, there's this plan of just going g5. When it looks like, in spite of losing a tempo, white is doing pretty well here. So people have moved away from that. They tried g6 for a while, but here after g4, bishop e3 and so on, white also seems a little better, because a6 is not that useful in this dragonish position. So the trend has shifted to going for the knight off move e5. Then white's point is he wants to go knight de2, and he wants to go g4 in one go, put the bishop on g2, the knight on g3, short castles, f4, and develop a bit of an attack. Black has two moves here. I think b5 is very interesting to meet g4 with b4, and the position becomes very sharp very quickly. But the main move at top level nowadays is h5, directed against this idea of g4 and playing against the knight on e2, which is now a little short on squares. It can't really get to g3. f4 and d4 are controlled by the black pawn, so it's not so easy for white what to do here. The most creative is the move knight g1, tending to regroup this guy. I don't really believe it's any good, but people have been doing that. And alternatively, the main lines are to play bishop g5 here, which looks logical, fighting for the d5 square, when we get some almost Sveshnikovian, I'm not sure if that's a word, sort of position, something like bishop e6 takes here, queen takes, knight d5, queen d8 back. That, yeah, I believe is more or less equal, or even though there's new ideas popping up here all the time, or he can go for a setup with g3, bishop g2, and then later decide if he wants to go bishop g5. Typically white goes a4 at some point. That's where the discussions are. I don't think it's winning. Black tends to hold himself quite well here. Not that anything is winning, but I don't think it's a serious problem for knight of players. But people don't know what else to do, so they've been discussing this position for quite a while now, and I don't expect these discussions to die down anytime soon. I hope that helps a little bit, and we are gonna move on to question number 3, which is asked by none other than Outremer. Let's see what Outremer has to say. Outremer is saying, "Hi Jan, in the last days I looked a bit at some variation of the Dutch. What a waste of time. Why didn't you watch TV or Making a Murderer is amazing? Do something useful with your time, not the Dutch." Anyway, I found a sideline, the so-called Hort Antoshin variation, with the following setting: f5, knight f6, d6, queen c7, followed by e5. And he gives a position which we're going to look at. This variation looks very tempting to me. So I'm wondering why it is such a little sideline. Can you explain the problems black could have with this line, and why the classical Dutch, the other line in this opening I like, is maybe better? I have no idea what the classical Dutch is. I guess it's e6, bishop e7, d6, queen e8 and that stuff, which I also think is pretty terrible for black. In general, I'm a huge opponent of the Dutch, so you've come, the Dutch opening, not the Dutch people, love the Dutch people, just to clarify. So you've come to the wrong place, but nevertheless, we shall look at the line you're giving. This can only take like half an hour until I set it up on the board. Here we are. The position after queen c7 looks tempting at first sight because you're planning to expand in the center very quickly, but black is also seriously neglecting his development, so I'm not overly surprised that it is such a sideline. I don't think it's very good, as you probably expected me to say, since we are in Dutch territory. I believe simple play for white with castles e5 and knight c3 should favor him. Black is not developed enough to go e4. And both knight g5 and knight h4, intending to go f3, favor white as far as I can tell. And else black has to be very careful for white busting open the position before it's developed. For example, if you go bishop e7, which looks natural, then white goes e4. And even though you might be tempo up on the classical Dutch, well, not really tempo up, but black went e5 in one go, I believe this is quite unpleasant for black. For example, fe4, knight g5, castles, de, knight, I don't know which knight, let's say knight ge4, and white has a good structure and should be slightly better. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of this variation. It's playable to get an unbalanced position as a surprise weapon, but I would never do it. Now the move here, if white wants to fight against e5, is to play bishop f4, which has been played by Wojtaszek, knight bd7 and d5, which, yeah, also looks pleasant for white. So, not a big fan, not surprised it's a sideline, but decent surprise weapon if you want a sharp game. Moving on. Mr. Salad Days. Excellent name, Salad Days. What are those days? I just had a salad. I'm not sure that's gonna take me through the show. Hi Jan, I usually play 3e4 in the Queen's Gambit accepted, but I experience some difficulties when my opponent answers with e5. They do it a lot. Mostly I must fight for a draw or end up losing. That's sad. Do you have a line you recommend after 3e5, or should I rather give up playing 3e4? No, don't give up 3e4, that's the best move, or the most critical move at the very least. So I'm all for it. The thing about it though is that play does become very complicated and white has to know quite some stuff. So judging by your description of the problem that you normally end up losing, you haven't looked into it very deeply and you have to know some theory here. In the position after e4, e5, best and pretty much only move for white is knight to f3, de5, then black is fine after queen d1. So you gotta go knight f3, e takes d4, and now bishop takes c4, temporarily sacrificing a pawn. And here there's a tremendous body of theory, but white is supposed to be a little better. The main lines are something like knight c6, short castles, bishop to e6, when white is an interesting choice between three good moves, bishop b5, knight bd2, and bishop takes e6. This is the simplest to play, takes, queen b3, and black's best is queen to d7, when white takes his pawn back, and then slowly tries to exploit the weakness of the light squares. It's not a big advantage for white, but I think it's slightly more pleasant to play. Rook b8, queen a6, and yeah, I think white is slightly better. Knight bd2, queen goes back to d3, quite often b3, and play that type of position. But there's many complicated lines, such as this one. For example, bishop b4 check is a very interesting move, when white can choose between bishop d2 and knight bd2. The problem is it can look scary at first sight because you are a pawn down, but the better prepared you are, the more you will realize that there's problems for black and white gets this pawn back pretty much in all of the lines after a couple of moves. So I believe this is the best line for white, but it is also tricky, and especially if you're not so experienced at opening work and sharp positions, might be easier to play a move like e3 or knight f3, where you're pretty much guaranteed to get your pawn back next move. But I wouldn't give up on it. I'd study up a bit on e4, e5, knight f3, and keep doing it. That's also a note to self, because I'm always too lazy to learn 3 e4, but I should really play it more regularly. I've played it once recently. Hope that helps. What else we got? We got Padawan Owns You. It's a very good username. Padawan Owns You is saying, "Hi Jan, in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, some 2400 plus players played the following setup. Long line position after h5. I think it's an interesting try for black to unbalance the position, but I would like to hear your opinion. Thanks a lot." I agree with you, Mr. Padawan. I also noticed I saw Shankland had a game recently, and I thought it was a good way to play for a win. Let's bring it up on the board and have a look. But yeah, it also caught my attention and I thought it was clever. I hadn't seen it before. But I do think that it's a pretty reasonable try. Where do I have it? This can only take hours, as usual. very confused. Too many move orders in my file. I actually prepare files for these shows, believe it or not, but I can't navigate it. I have no idea where I stored it. Anyway, let's try to make our way to that position. And basically I can't say very much except for I do fully agree. So c6, queen c2, which is a critical move, e3, bishop f5 is fine for black. I'm still pondering if I should cover all this stuff, and I think I will in part 3 of my opening repertoire series. Against 1d4 part 2 just came out about the Vienna, but we gotta know what to do against d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3 as well. And I've been reading up on all kinds of sharp lines like this one. Here there's different moves instead of bishop d3. There's bishop e2, but it's not very dangerous. Black has queen a5, planning knight e4, so that's fine. And bishop d3, h6. I didn't screw up the move order, but we'll get there. Bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, knight h5. It's very double-edged, but it compares quite favorably to like positions out of the Ragosian, for example, after knight f3, bishop b4, c, d, e, d, bishop g5. Often you get lines where I hope I can produce one of these lines, I'm not that sure. Lines like this where black then retreats his bishop all the way to f8, and I believe this line we're talking about is probably a better version of that. So what can I say? I like it. I'm not sure if it's an equalizer, but it certainly leads to a sharp position. f4 I've been looking at is no good because of g5. f3 has recently been tried to avoid this g5, knight h5, but f3 also has its problems. Then black goes bishop d6 and queen b8 or queen c7. So yeah, I think it's a very valid attempt to unbalance the position. There's some sharp lines here. After takes, and h5, which is not forced, but looks reasonable to chase this knight away. White can go e4, and the position becomes very, very sharp. Black has to do some analyzing here. But it strike me as playable, and yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. So yeah, thanks for pointing it out. I basically agree. Let's get to the next. Sorry, as I said, that I'm mainly ignoring the chat in these shows. Yeah, I just gotta get through the questions that have been posted in the comment section. Also, apologies if I can't get to all of them, but I'm working on it. We have CB Einstein, who's not a premium member. He says he will become one today, and his question is about the London system. We'll see if further up he did become a premium member and put his question. Ritvik Radhakrishnan is saying, hello Jan, I usually play the exchange Queen's Gambit Declined. A lot of interest in the exchange Queen's Gambit Declined, in which some people play an early c5 instead of playing c6. Is there a way to exploit that? If not, what are the plans and setups White can play with? I never know any plans, I just make moves. For example, after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, c, d, e, d, bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, castles, bishop d7, bishop d3, knight e7, queen c2, c5. Is the setup with knight g2 the best? Planning an early f3, e4. Also, if black plays h6, what's the best response? Bishop f6, bishop f4, or bishop h4? As usual, the answer is it depends. But to address your problem with c5 a little more directly, let's try to go there. You've given this position, and here White is not really forced to go queen c2 yet. In some lines where black played an earlier c6, the one we've just seen, it makes a lot of sense to go queen c2 directed against bishop f5. But in this position I wouldn't play queen c2, I would play either knight f3 or knight g2, depending on which setup you prefer in the typical structures after c6. And the point is, if you go knight e2 here, let's say, now black goes c5, then you don't really need your queen on c2. Here you can just take, for example, dc, knight c5, short castles, and you're slightly better because black has an isolated pawn and white hasn't wasted any time moving his queen around. So yeah, I wouldn't go queen c2 unless black has committed to c6. And same story for knight f3 here. If you prefer your knight on f3 in the lines after c6, which I do, but most people like it better on e2. So after queen c2, c5 is a valid move, and here I'm not sure which move is best, because now after dc5, knight c5, white has lost the tempo and things are no longer so simple. I probably go knight e2 in this position, hoping for CD, ED when white is a little better. But black can unbalance the position with C4, bishop F5, and these structures are very, very tricky to handle. And yeah, as to where to retreat the bishop after H6, really depends. Like here I would probably go bishop H4. That's hard to say generally. But bottom line, if you're scared of early C5s, don't go queen C2 so early, then it loses a lot of its sting. And yeah, most move orders where you're forced to go queen C2, or where you should go queen C2, involve black playing an early C6. And you go queen C2 directly against bishop F5. Against an early knight BD7, you don't really need to do that. Hope that helped. Mr. SK3. What is SK3 saying? Hi Jan, when I play King's Indian attack, I had that question I didn't get. I'm sorry SK3. Gotta tell you in advance, I did not fully understand you. When I play King's Indian attack, I know white's plan is to attack on the king side. However, after playing like H4, H5 I guess, or knight F1, then I don't know how to bring my A-file rook to the attack. You can't bring your A-file rook to the attack. You're gonna have to checkmate without that A-file rook. Keep it on A1 and hope it holds together the queen side. The other question is that white always needs to sacrifice knight or bishop on H6 or F6 square, but once I sacrifice it, how to keep the attack? I don't know, that really depends on the position. I in general only sacrifice it if it's good, and if you see how you can keep the attack after that. If you can't see that, then don't sacrifice a knight or bishop on H6 or F6. And also, I'd like to point out the position you've given in the diagram doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not sure where these questions are coming from. You probably saw some model games or you read a book on the King's Indian attack. But as usual, it all depends on the specifics. Sorry, this is still the old position. Let's see if we can get to yours. My point is, after E6 castles, C5, D3, knight C6, knight BD2. To reach your position, black would have to go bishop D6 here, which is not a good idea once the knight is already on F6. There's some lines where you go bishop D6, then you follow up with knight E7, but in the line you gave after bishop D6, E4, castles, rook E1, queen C7, black's setup doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because white goes queen E2 and threatens to win a piece with E5 with tempo. And here probably the best move black has is something like bishop E7, losing a tempo compared to normal lines where black starts with bishop E7. So black should go bishop E7 here if he wants to play this line, E4 short castles, rook E1, B5. And here there's a lot of theoretical discussions. I believe there's recent games, Svidler Kayakin, for example, with E takes D5. General practice has shown that these plans to checkmate with E5, knight F1, H4, bishop H4, bishop F4 don't really work here if black is fast and launches his counterplay with B5. So I'm not sure I can help you that much, but I don't think you should be too focused on learning that one plan and trying to checkmate, but you should start at an earlier stage and try to figure out what the difference is between the different move orders are and what the plans are. I know many of us are taught this plan, like Fischer played it as a kid. You go E5, H4, knight F1, bishop F4 and checkmate. But things aren't that simple, unfortunately, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm not sure I got that question right. Robin Nilsson, 94. I guess that's the date of birth, but you never know. Could be a reminder of the time Germany won the FIFA World Cup, but probably it's not. Hey Jan, I play the Adams attack against the Najdorf. I have no idea what that is either. I'm assuming it's the move H3, since this is what the question is about, but earlier it was called the Anand attack, now the Adams attack. I don't know. But when black players instead go for 5 knight C6, I have some trouble since I don't play the Richter-Rauser. You don't have to play it, you just have to play against it if you play the open Sicilian. What do you think of the move 6H3 here? Is it playable or should I learn to play the Richter-Rauser? Thanks for your answer and your awesome work for chess. Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't think it's very good. I think you should learn the Richter-Rauser, or more specifically, you should learn the move 6 bishop G5, which is a much more critical test, and the reason why most people don't play the Richter-Rauser and play the Najdorf instead. So let's put it on the board. Where do we have the board? The position after d6. h3 is playable, it's not a terrible move. But the problem is, after a6 it's so popular because on this transposition to the dragon lines with g6, a6 not a very useful move. But knight c6 is a tremendously useful move. And here, this dragon with g6, bishop g7, short castles against h3, I believe is a pretty good version for black. And here I'd be happy. I know there's some games, and it has been played by people, but I don't think this is very critical. So yeah, I wouldn't go h3. I'd go, if I was an e4 player, I'd go bishop g5. And here, objectively, black's life is not easy, as I said, which is a reason that Richter-Rauser is not so popular. So have a look at some model games here and go with that one. It's gonna pay off bigger dividends in the long term than going h3 there. Good luck. Do we have more questions? I know we do. Sir Albus is saying, "Hi Jan, I need a good line against 1b3. What is the best line against 1b3? Thank you for your answer and have a good day." Very much to the point. I don't know, it's a matter of taste as usual, but I can give some lines. 1b3 is not a bad move. It's the best of all the non-principled moves like c4, d4, e4, knight f3 and g3 are all mainstream moves. And b3, yeah, I believe comes next. You could argue b3 or knight c3, but it makes sense. You want to put the bishop on the long diagonal, so it's not silly. There's a couple systems that I consider to be sound for black. One I think which is quite easy is to go d5, bishop b2 and bishop f5. And then just follow up with e6, knight f6, bishop e7, short castles. See what happens. That's very playable without having to know a lot of theory. The main line and arguably the most critical is e5, bishop b2, knight c6, e3, while he's trying to go bishop b5 quickly to put pressure on the black e-pawn. And here the trendy move that people play is knight f6, bishop b5, and the strange looking move bishop to d6, just defending this pawn. Preparing to go castle, rook e8, and a6, and play this position, which is roughly equal. I also have a bit of a soft spot for the line with d5, bishop b5, bishop d6, but this leads to much sharper play after f4, for example, or even after knight f3. So the easiest choice is to go for this knight f6, bishop d6 stuff if you want to go e5. Else the other line I mentioned with d5, bishop f5 I think is playable with knowing very little. And yeah, b3 doesn't happen that often, so no reason to stress about it, but it's not a terrible move. What else we got? We got Andrea78. Very happy to know Jan will comment on Tata Steel. Yeah, I'm happy too. It's starting day after tomorrow. I'm gonna do the first 2 rounds with Fiona, then I'll be out for 3 days, but Lawrence Trent is here, and then I'm gonna return with our boy Peter Svidler, who's coming to town for the second half of the tournament, starting from round 6. So yeah, very much looking forward to it. Hope it works out. Anyway, the Vienna repertoire was amazing. Thank you. Yeah, check out my new video series, part 2, the Vienna. It's a good opening. 2 questions, Andrea. What are your recommendations on lines like d4, knight f6, bishop g5, and the related d4, knight f6, knight c3? P.S. Wait for new episodes of your repertoire for black is such a pain. That's why he's asking, but you're going to have to wait for the long version, because I'm going to cover all the sidelines, probably in part 4. Which, yeah, is gonna take a while, but I'll give you the short version, the very short version. 2 quick points. First of all, if you're gonna stick to my repertoire, depending what I recommend in part 3, but very likely you can go 1d5, against which bishop g5 loses a lot of its sting, because then h6, bishop h4, c5 is one very good way to meet it. f6 is another good way. So if you smell your opponent might play the Trompovsky, it often makes sense to consider 1d5. And in the position after bishop g5, I believe all the lines are playable. My personal favorite and the most popular at the moment at the highest level has always been the move d5. Then to meet e3 with c5, you typically get this position bishop f6, gf6, and here white has tried all kinds of things, c4, dc5, knight c3, but I don't think any of them comes close to promising him an advantage. I believe black is a very sound position with the two bishops and the pawn center. I like black's position here, and I don't think this line is dangerous at all, as top practice confirms, I believe. And the same story, if they take on f6 immediately, you have a choice, but I think gf6 is also fine. Some other options here like c4, but they're not dangerous either. So that's my favorite against the Tompovsky. Knight c3, d5. Yeah, this is a bigger complex here. White chooses between bishop f4 and bishop g5. As a rule of thumb, black is fine if he just goes for an early c5 against both. Here you can go c5, might transpose to stuff we just saw. And against bishop f4, you can also go c5, e3, cd, ed. Now take a timeout to parry knight b5 with a6. And black is quite comfortable as well. So yeah, none of this stuff is critical, but of course they are legal moves and you're gonna run into them once in a while. Let's get a new question. Kevin Walker has written a long essay. Hi Jan, I sometimes play a strange sideline of the Scotch that hasn't been explored very deeply. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, ed, knight d4, knight f6, knight c6, bc, bishop d3, d5, short castles, de, queen e1. And now I often get this queenless endgame with a bad structure against the bishop pair. For example, okay, we're gonna get to that position. I know that the evaluation has to be around equal and that you as an e5 player who also considers the Scotch harmless would prefer black. I agree with the second part, not with the first part, but I would still like to ask what white should do in this position. Which pawn setup might be favorable? Should I get rid of the rooks? No, you should not. Chess is concrete and general advice sometimes is impossible, but maybe you could try. I can try, but I'm still gonna have to be honest with you, Kevin. Don't play that line. That's the main thing I'm gonna tell you. And I'm also gonna tell you why. If I manage to bring it up on the board, which is not 100% certain. Here we go. Good old Scotch. E takes d4, knight to f6, knight c6, bc, bishop d3. This is a sideline, but okay, can't be too terrible. d5. And now castles. This is just not a good move. D takes e4, queen e1. And here you've given bishop e7, but bishop e7 is far from the best move in this position. Like, it might equalize, but I think black is better if he goes queen e7 here, just defending the extra pawn. Some sneaky stuff like queen c3 here, that's what they do. Queen c5, sorry, rook e1. But black is better. Bishop e6, bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, and we get a much better version of these positions you were opting for, because here, after long castles, black has a serious lead in development, threatening a little check on d1. So white has to go back, rook e1, bishop e7. And I don't think you're in time to get your pieces out, really. Like, it might not be much worse, but it's certainly a position where I'd take black without thinking. Still, I'll make an effort to answer your question. After bishop e7, not the best move. Queen e7 is better, and bishop f5 is better. But after bishop e7, takes, queen d5. Also not sure I'd go queen d5. I think I'd castle here and not be worried about losing this pawn, because with the two bishops and an open position, black would always have good compensation. So queen d5, knight c3, takes. Even this position, yeah, I think this is more or less equal. Black has the two bishops and is fine, but white has some prospects long term because of the weaknesses. No, what you want to do is exchange the dark squared bishops, which is going to be hard to do. You don't want to exchange the rooks. If you take off all the rooks, then the bishop pair will be quite powerful in such positions, and these pawns will be easy to defend. So don't do that. Try to develop quickly and try to exchange the dark squared bishops. I'm not sure what black is supposed to do here. f5 is probably a decent move. Bishop f5 looks natural, but then rook e1. You're not afraid, of course, of exchanging this knight for either bishop. Let's say long castles, bishop g5, hoping to exchange something. Black shouldn't do that. But after f6 here, for example, once again, it's concrete, but you could try to get rid of your knight to exchange one of the bishops with knight g3. And yeah, it's roughly equal. But yeah, mainly don't play the line. I've given you a couple of reasons why. I know it's always tempting to play sidelines and surprise your opponents and play cute moves like queen e1, but normally there's a reason why no one does that. So yeah, sorry, I know you expected this answer, but It's the truth. Germaniculus. Or German Iculus, I don't know. Hi Jan, love your work and dry humor. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from your video series and I really think you've changed my playing style from aggressive to more classical. That's what I do, I make people dull. I wonder, however, why you don't publish ebooks, just like, for example, Van Kempen or Niklas. Mainly laziness, but now I got some time on my hands and yeah, we might publish some of the notes on the D4 series and see what we can get. So yeah, it could come, but I tend to promise way too much, so I'm not going to give you a timeline, but I have it in mind. I assume you don't like when a Dutchman appears more diligent than a German. No, Robin is way more diligent than me. No competition. My question about openings is this. There are many I just answered this, right? There are many possibilities against the Trompovsky, but since it isn't played that much, I have some trouble against it, and I haven't settled for a line. What line do you recommend for black, and is there a book or series to learn about it? Like I said, I like the line with knight f6, d5, which I just talked about. Series not yet. I'm going to cover all this stuff in part 4 of my video series. I'm guessing, but I don't know off the top of my head, that it has been covered in some other series. Maybe by... I honestly don't know. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, I like this knight f6, d5. And book-wise, I believe Avruch wrote a book on meeting the d4 sidelines, which I'm going to have to study before I come to my video series on all these sidelines. But in general, Avruch is very reliable, so whatever he does, I'm not sure what he recommends, but tends to be very reliable. Let's get the next question. No, that's not a question, but I should still address it. Did I jump over something? Looks like I missed something. No, maybe the earlier question was deleted. I don't know. Don't want to let you down and overlook your questions. No, things like where. Okay, so where was I? As you can see, I can scroll through all the chat here. It's very exciting. Yeah, looks like the earlier question disappeared. But concerning my video series in the Nimzo-Indian, there were some mistakes in the 4b6 video, which I've addressed in many shows, but I can't expect everyone to watch the shows. So I've just updated it and I've uploaded a new video on the 4 Queen C2 b6. Check it out if you wanna see it. Go to wherever it is, Learn Video Series, a wide repertoire against the Nimzo-Indian, and I've uploaded a new chapter on 4b6 addressing that problem, because yeah, I don't know what happened in that original video. I must have been in a hurry, let's put it. And yeah, my b6 work wasn't very good, but it has become a little more popular. Morozevich has had some games, so I've updated it. I'm now recommending the move 6d5 in this line, and yeah, check it out. Mr. C24 is, I guess he's answering an earlier question. We will get to Abraham Payton. Hi Jan, question from Benko Benoni players who often encounter d4, knight f6, knight f3, c5, c4, cd, knight d4. Yeah, that's one of my main workhorses, this position for white. What system should black use? I remember you discourage using the Vaganyan gambit from previous videos. Now I encourage it. Give me that free pawn. But yeah, I don't think it's very good. But I'm wondering if you favor the system proposed by GM Huschenbeet, which certainly seems solid and established, or the one proposed by GM Svidler, which seems so respectful. He's always writing down the GM. I suppose I'm drawn towards GM Svidler's Grunfeld-like approach myself. But is it sound? Have you gotten a chance to review his ideas against bishop f4? I must admit I haven't prepared very much to answer your question, but I do know what you're talking about. And I'm with Niklas on this one. Mainly for stylistic reasons. Because yeah, I'm not much of a Grunfeld guy, and I'm not that motivated normally to put my... Not sure under which move order I have this stuff, but it doesn't really matter. Let's go with this one. I'm not that motivated to get my bishop to g7 normally, so Svidler's line is a bit more experimental, and I think you might catch some opponents off guard. But after bishop f4, bishop g7. I think there were some crazy lines with knight db5 that ended in some endgame where I don't know how it went. I don't know, d6 b5, I think. They ended in some endgame in Svidler's analysis, if I recall correctly, where black was a pawn down and had some activity. I think it's a practical, very good try, because no one's going to be able to navigate all this stuff over the board, and the alternatives are harmless. As for the final positions in Svidler's lines, I wasn't sure if white wasn't slightly better with the extra pawn, but I'm a pawn grabber, and I do believe that this system will never go out of fashion. Like, Svidler didn't give it because it doesn't really fit with the Grunfeld repertoire and because it's a lot of work. But I do think, I've always thought, this is the best reply to this stuff, and it's the one that bothers me most. g3, queen b6. I believe this is all the stuff that Niklas is giving. White has some alternatives here. Bishop f4, bishop g5, knight b5, a3. So yeah, it's a bit of work, but it's the best system and the one that white players, or me at least, are most afraid of when entering this line. So I would certainly go for this. What else we got? Mr. Blunderbishop. Blunderbishop is saying, hello, hello, Jan. It's multilingual. When facing the French defense with white, the following variation often causes headaches to me. e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, de4, knight e4, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6, knight f3, castles, queen d2, b6. The future black bishop on b7. The black queenside play after I cast along is difficult for me to handle. Is the kingside attack the right path for white? And if yes, what would be good moves to launch it? Thanks and kind regards, Marco. Yeah, I don't really have a clue, Marco. I'm not much of an e4 guy, and I've never played the French or looked at it much, so it's really not my territory. The first thing I have to say is, if these positions bother you, you have a very valid alternative in going e5 and getting a more French structure, which nowadays is more popular than bishop g5, because bishop g5 gives black a choice between many interesting lines, bishop b4, bishop e7, and the de4 you mentioned. And after knight e4, bishop e7, bishop f6, there's also gf6, which I always thought was a very reasonable move positionally. And yeah, this stuff I don't know very much about, frankly. Queen d2, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, long castles, knight d7. It's the start of a sharp theory debate. White is supposed to go h4, and I'm not very up to date. I think they used to go c5, but then knight fg5 was asking some questions. Bishop g5 you can never really do, because you're going to get checkmated after hg. Knight fg5 threatens, knight takes h7. So I don't know much here, but I've seen Bacro played like this and got an advantage. It's, as usual, very move by move, which is my approach to chess, and also has to be your approach to this position at the very least, because it's very hard to say, yeah, you gotta go h4, knight g5, then g4, and your attack will be faster. It's move by move stuff. And theoretically speaking, I believe black should go bishop e7 before going c5, and this is where the debates are ongoing. White has tried queen f4, and it's a messy position. Yeah, I understand. I wouldn't be that comfortable here with white. I'm not an attacking player, or I'd like to be, but I'm not that good at it. So I would probably go e5 instead, especially if these positions bother you. And else, yeah, analyze it. Put the position after h4, c5 or bishop e7 on the board. Put on an engine if it helps. Go to the analysis section. They have an engine and all the games that are played here, and try to get a feel for it. I have no idea, honestly, what the verdict is. I've noticed that it's an ongoing debate. Sorry, French, not my forte. Mr. Luke. Hi Jan, in the game Nübeck-Carlsen from the Olympia 2014, Carlsen played bishop e6 after a long line in the Slav. All classical games in my database, the black players followed the world champion. Our Bantaton blitz game. I tried knight d7 and after bishop f4 and some weak moves from your side because of tiredness. Nah, it was just because of weakness. I got a nice position. Have you looked at the line-up, and is there a way to punish black's knight d7, or do you think it's a viable alternative to the main line? Thanks in advance, Luke. Thinly veiled brag here by Luke, who probably crushed me in that Banter Blitz game. I don't know, I've looked at it now that you posed the question. I haven't looked at it in that much detail, but in general I had made a mental note that that line is nothing special for white because of this bishop e6, and I didn't really feel the need to improve on it. And yeah, my computer says, this is as wise as I've gotten, that after knight d7 immediately, white has a very strong move, queen d3, or at least that's what it spit out with a point knight takes e5, queen to g3, and white wins material, it looks like. So black has to find something else here, and it got messy. I was looking at queen a5, queen g3, stuff like this, but it didn't look that trustworthy. Oh, sorry, board. Here we go. That happens like twice per show, so the first one, you shall forgive me. So it's this position, and here, after d5, bishop e6 is the equalizer, or at least that's what I thought when after queen d3, black goes knight g4, and after the exchange of queens later, he tends to be fine. So knight d7, queen d3 is what my computer spit out, intending to go queen g3, when, yeah, I couldn't equalize it. I haven't spent oceans of time, but I don't really see a reason for black to go here, even though queen d3 is a tough move to find. I think bishop e6 is a better move, and yeah, don't rely on everybody playing as weakly and as tiredly as I did in the Banter Blitz. So I believe bishop e6 is very sound. No reason to innovate there. What else we got? Awake. Awake is saying, "Hi Jan, do you think this gambit in the Queen's Gambit declined Tarrasch variation is playable for white, or maybe as a one-game weapon, and what is black's best answer to 5e4? d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5, cd, ed, e4, d, e, bishop c4, cd, queen b3. I have a feeling Awake knows what answer I'm gonna give, but he wanted to double check, because the answer as usual is no, it's not good, it's not playable. Black is better after 7 moves, clearly better, don't do it. But let me argue my case. Well, to be honest, I had never heard of this gambit before your question, so what I've done is what most people do. I put on the engine in that position, and the engine very quickly spits out a black advantage. Then it really becomes a judgment call, like, yeah, e4, I wouldn't do it. The Tarrasch is not a scary opening. Knight f3, knight c6, and all the main lines with g3 are slightly better for white, and dc5 is also slightly better for white, so really no reason to go here. But after e4, de, I thought the idea was d5, but I also don't like it much. Your line is bishop c4, c takes d4, and queen b3, which, yeah, maybe you could catch someone by surprise here. I wouldn't gamble on it, but yeah, it depends on your style of play, the level of opponent, and so on and so forth. The objective answer is black is clearly better here if he finds the move knight f6, so it's really a gamble that he's not going to find it. He's going to go dc3, which doesn't work, or queen d7, which is playable, but after that white has some compensation. But after knight f6, bishop f7, king to e7, as far as I can tell, black is seriously better already, so I wouldn't do it. I haven't analyzed very deeply, but it didn't look good. Anyway, to evaluate the risk of people who will find this, I can't do for you. I wouldn't do it, but I'm not such a big bluffer in the opening. I like to have a half bluff where black plays the right moves. I'm still equal or in the game, and here the price seems too high to me to enter this, because I think this position is close to losing for white, so nah, I wouldn't do it. Mr. Pawn Grabber, I've read his question before, he's gonna contradict his name a little bit because he's afraid of the Blackmar-Demer gambit, which is perfectly suited for a Pawn Grabber. Oh no, it's not the Blackmar-Demer, sorry, it's the Albin counter gambit, d4, d5, c4, e5, here on the board. Could you please recommend a concrete line after DE, D4, knight f3, knight c6? It's one of those things I'm pretty sure I've answered in an earlier opening clinic, which I don't worry about very much because I feel like, first of all, no one plays it. And if someone has it in their repertoire, then I'm very confident I can prepare for half an hour and sort of refute it. But I've never really gotten around to putting in the work. Still, I know a little bit. After knight f3, knight c6, I believe the best plans are connected to going a3 or knight bd2, often transpose into each other. I don't think there's a big difference. I'd probably start with knight bd2, but you could make the same case for starting with a3. The main line is something like knight g7, a3. When if black goes knight g6, white gets a better endgame after knight b3. Attacking this pawn, knight e5, knight e5, knight e5, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes c4, e4. And white is seriously better because of his lead in development. So black players have tried some other things, but none of them look very impressive. I think they've tried a5 here, playing to go a4 and to stop b4. Then white has knight b3, knight f5, and many pleasant options, but the easiest to go e4, takes, takes. Take here with the pawn up, even though it's doubled, it's a much better endgame for white. So that's easy. And yeah, black can try something else, maybe bishop g4 or something, which I have to admit I've never studied in much detail. I find it very hard to believe h3, bishop h5, that this could be playable. But here I'd be on my own and would have to trust that my pawn grabbing operation will succeed. So I don't know, I think white is better here with many moves. g3, g4, a3, intending b4. But yeah, that's always, there is a risk that black gets some counterplay. I just don't think it's enough, and he's normally not in time. In the Blackmar, whatever it's called, the Elvin's counter gambit, it's not that terrible, but I don't believe in it. And if you're really scared of it, you can always go knight f3, stopping e5, and then after knight c6, if they insist on it, c4, e5. You can go knight takes e5, which is seriously better for white as well. So yeah, I'm torn. I don't respect it, and well, I respect it, but I think I'd be able to prepare for it, and if I was really scared of it, I'd go 1 or 2 knight f3 to just avoid it. Not sure that's very sound logic, but that's where I'm at normally with these like half sound openings. If they would annoy me in a practical game and my opponent could do it and I haven't had time to look at it, then I tend to avoid them with the move order. And yeah, if I have time to prepare, then I try to refute them, which with the Albans should be possible. And all the lines I've given, I think, are better for white. And what else we got? Lapus Neanul. He has a question about the symmetrical English. Horribly boring opening, but I end up there sometimes. c4, c5, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, knight f3, d6, castles, knight f6. Now against d4, if black plays dc4, I think it means cd4, we transpose to my favorite line in the symmetrical English. Nice. However, white has the option, black has the option of playing castles, transposing to a Yugoslav King's Indian, which I'd rather avoid for now. That's a very strange reason to avoid d4, because first of all, no one's gonna do that, and secondly, it's quite pleasant for white. Anyway, let me try to bring it up. There's a later question about a3, bishop f5, d3, queen d7, which I will address as well. Symmetrical English. One of these lines, which, yeah, I don't think are scary, but I never feel like I really understand them. Here we go. Knight f3, d6, castles. Yeah, I've played the system with bishop f5 immediately here, which leads to similar positions, not allowing d4. Well, after knight f6, I would go d4 in an instant, and after castles, you have a pleasant choice. You can go for the Yugoslav attack main lines with d5. If you're scared of them and you're more of a positional grinder, you can also go dc5, dc5, bishop e3, which is not that easy for black. Not that obvious how you equalize here. Bishop e6, queen a4, and I believe white can put a little pressure. So I think this should be right up your wheelhouse, and really no reason to avoid this move order. But to answer the question, a3 castles, rook b1, bishop f5, d3, queen d7. Queen d7. My feeling is always if black manages to exchange these bishops, then black is fine. So white has to go rook e1 here, bishop h3, bishop h1, and these positions aren't so easy here. I sometimes end up with, in my move order, with an earlier bishop f5. While the computer gives equality here or says black is fine, I find them a little easier to play for white. So I would certainly do that and then go for the usual business with b4 and so on the queen side. Take it from there. I believe this is quite playable for white, but I really see zero reason to avoid d4, especially if you like the position after cd knight d4. So yeah, that's all I got. Champ24, not a premium member, but good username. The picture of yours reminds me of the Joker in The Dark Knight. Oh, that's very odd. I have no idea how you would come to that conclusion. Certainly not a picture of the movie with my head photoshopped on the Joker's body at all. No, I'm lying. That's exactly what it is. But yeah, thanks for chiming in, Champ24. Schachfreak1999 is saying, hey Jan, first of all, thanks for these very instructive shows. You're very welcome. I've learned a lot from this format. Glad to hear that. For my next game, I need to know what I should play. Don't we all? Can you please help me by giving a bit theory and also name the plans of this recommendation? Name the plans of this recommendation. I will be black. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d4, ed. I think you forgot a move there in your line. I looked at this earlier. I think you forgot to include castles and knight f6, but I know what you're talking about. So let's get to it. And interestingly, I think there was a very similar question later on in the show. So people worry a lot about whatever it's called. I think it's the Max Lange attack, but I'm bad with names of all this Italian stuff, so I could be wrong about that. That's still the old line. Let's go here. So, couple points. Bishop c4, bishop c5. The normal move order to get this is castle, knight f6 and d4, which I think you forgot to include, but I think this is what you mean. First of all, I wouldn't enter it. I wouldn't go ed4 here. I would go bishop takes d4, bishop takes, knight takes, f4, d6, which is another line that is sometimes played, but which I think is fine for black, fe, de. Main line is bishop g5, and here many moves are fine. Bishop e6 is fine. Even knight e6 is... No, not knight e6. Bishop e6 is fine, and I like the move queen e7, hinting at queen c5 stuff. Knight a3, and once again there's many good moves. I quite like the move because it looks so weird. Rook g8 here. This is a computer move preparing for bishop f6 and some potential counterplay on the g file, for example, after c3, knight e6. So that's what I would do, but I do want to answer your question. After e takes d4, e5, d5, e takes f6, d takes c4. First of all, the line you're giving is not very critical. The critical test, and I think we have a question about that later, is f g7, rook g8, bishop g5. This could more or less transpose. But this stuff is a little dangerous for black. Here I don't know how to equalize, hence I would avoid it. But the line you're giving is a line that's very popular at club level, rook e1, bishop e6, and knight to g5, because people get very excited that after queen takes f6, they can win a piece with knight e6, fe, queen h5 check, followed by queen takes c5. There's a trick many of us are taught as a kid, and many of us stick with it because they're so excited about it. So anyway, the main theoretical move here is queen to d5. Which leads to complicated play, knight c3, queen f5, and I don't know, some weird lines, g4, queen g6, knight ce4, with a mess. I think black is supposed to be quite fine here, but it's messy. But if you end up in this position and you want to surprise your opponent, who will probably know queen d5 and then bang out knight c3 because he's very excited that you can't take, because if queen takes d5, if you want to surprise him, just play g6 here. This is a move that's never played, but I don't know why. It looks like a perfectly good move to me. If white takes on e6, you go king f7, and the king is temporarily a bit out in the open, but it's a much bigger factor that the white pieces are a little underdeveloped and black has a strong center, and black is already better here. Let's say rook e4, rook e8, and you overtake the initiative, or queen e2, queen to d5, or d3 is also strong. Now this is a good position for black. So I think g6 is an underrated move, and I'm not sure what white should do about it. Knight d2 is a computer move, but then after queen d5, say queen g4, short castles. I believe black is also better. So go g6 if you want to go for this line and surprise your opponent. You won't be in trouble there, or at least I hope so. But generally, long term, as I mentioned, after d4, I think bishop takes d4 is a better move. Good luck with that game. We get Spills. Spills. What is Spills saying? Hey Jan, my question is about the Queen's Indian position. D4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, a3, bishop b7, knight c3, g6. Wondering what you think of this line for black. Dynamic winning attempt or garbage? It's a thin line between these two. Ever played either side of this position? Thank you for your thoughts. And for a fun new movie, I recommend Hateful Eight. Yeah, I got tickets. When Svidler is going to come to town, I'm going to go with him. I'm going to have to wait a bit. We're going on the 29th to see it in English on 70mm. Excited about that one, but yeah, I'm going to have to wait a bit. I like Tarantino, so excited about that. As for the line, I'm not sure. I'm a little torn. As I said, between and yeah, that's a valid winning attempt, which is often the case, because in order for it to be a valid winning attempt with black, you have to, or you don't always have to, but often you have to go into territory and to unbalance it, or you can. Like, normally I advise to stick to the main lines, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, this move g6, well, the main move here is d5, and with very good reason. And I think d5 is also a fairly valid winning attempt, actually, because the positions after cd, knight d5 are quite unbalanced, and you can outplay your opponent there. So I would probably stick to that. As for g6, I've had it once, and I thought I was extra clever here when I played queen d3, preparing e4 and not allowing bishop takes f3. Bishop g7, e4, and yeah, then I did whatever. Bishop e2, I had to retreat the queen to c2, and I was slightly better, but I looked at it afterwards and I came to the conclusion that bishop f3 is not really a threat here, so you can start with queen c2, and if they go bishop g7, e4, white has saved the tempo and is obviously better. While if black takes on f3, I think both ef and gf favor white. This is more aesthetically pleasing, but it's a little harder to generate play against the king side after it. So yeah, I think white is better here, but it's a complicated position, the sort of unbalanced winning attempt you're looking for. But e takes f3 followed by speedy development I think is also a little scary for black. So I probably wouldn't do it, but I don't think it's total garbage. It leads to unbalanced positions and is, yeah, borderline playable, let's call it like that. Like, I wouldn't be too surprised if I caught myself playing it once. Playing for a win against a weaker opponent, but clearly d5 is the main move for a reason. What else we got? Mr. Fabi. Mr. Fabi is saying. What is Mr. Fabi saying? Hi Jan, my question is about the Ruy Lopez, in which white plays c3 and d4 without a previous h3. See diagram. I'm familiar with that one. As you certainly know, this position, yep, I do know all that. Here black almost exclusively plays bishop g4, also true, after which white's two main options are bishop e3 and d5. How do you assess this line, and which of these options on move 10 do you consider to be stronger? As a martial player, are you happy to enter, or would you advise players to deviate with e takes d4? No, e takes d4 is bad. You gotta deviate with knight takes d4 if you wanna deviate. Let's get to it slowly but surely. And yeah, that's a full-fledged main line, so I won't be able to go into that much detail. It has just been played in a game, Geary Carlson, which arguably is the highest possible level, the world number 1 against the world number 2. Is Geary still number 2 in the live rating list? I don't know. But yeah, to answer these points, and I'll give you it's one question because they sort of belong together. After d4, d6 is fine transposing. I normally, used to play knight takes d4 here. E takes d is bad because of e5, but knight takes d4 is a valid alternative, which I believe equalizes and which is exclusive to the Marshall move order. You can't get that, of course, in this move order. After d4, bishop g4, I think d5 is pretty harmless. It leads to a position with a lot of pieces on the board, but I think black is absolutely fine. Something like this, and black gets a very pleasant version of a Najdorf structure. So yeah, I don't think this is a problem. Some people play it, but in general, it's not considered critical. Bishop e3, however, is a very different story. Bishop e3 is a full-fledged mainline and a serious attempt at an opening advantage, so I certainly consider this the more critical move. There's many lines here. Bishop h5, e takes d4. The main line is something like knight a5. Oh no, sorry. First takes, knight a5, bishop c2, and here either c5 or knight c4. Knight c4 is what Carlsen played. I always considered this to be the best line for black, but it leads to a very sharp, unbalanced play, where white has very fair chances for an opening advantage. After b3, knight b6, there's different plans available. Knight bd2 or a4. So yeah, this is a critical line, and I believe black is okay, but as mentioned, I normally avoid it with my Marshall move order, and then after castles d4, go knight takes d4, which there's a lot of theory as well, but I think it's fine. But certainly, if you're interested in playing it with white, look at bishop e3, not at d5. d5 is not that exciting in my opinion. Fred Eddy, or Fradedi, not sure how to pronounce that one, is saying, "Hi Jan, as an addition to my usual d4 stuff, I have recently added the double fianchetto reti. After knight f3, c5, I played b3. Alright. And had a question about the following line. g6, bishop b2, knight f6. Are you supposed to take on f6 like the famous Karpov game, or are you supposed to ignore it?" You're supposed to ignore it, I believe. Sorry, this is still the old position, so knight f3, c5, b3. I've never done that, but how bad can it be? You're fianchettoing your bishop. My worry would be that black goes d6 and e5 here, I would guess, but let's answer the question. g6, bishop b2, knight f6. The conventional wisdom, and I think conventional wisdom is right, is that white is better here if he can get in c4 and then knight c3 and control this d5 square. But after c4, black is in time to go d5 in this position. And here, I think black is absolutely fine. Queen wherever, let's say back to d8. This position I quite like for black with the two bishops. Therefore, I believe it's well known that black has to get in a quick d5 in this sort of structure, and most people will. Therefore, I don't think bishop f6 is the right move. You should probably play something slower like c4. e4 has been tried in a couple of games recently. Interesting move as well. I don't think white is an advantage. Black's play is very logical. Bishop g7, short castle, and this bishop has some drawbacks here, but I don't think you want to take on f6. Say you want to go c4 or e4. And again, I'm a well-known bishop fanatic, so my opinion might be biased. Doesn't mean it's not right, but it's always biased towards bishops a little bit. Princess Selisa is saying, "Hi Jan, I lately got in the position after the notebone with white. How do you recommend to continue here? And what are the plans? Is there perhaps something to avoid this variation after dc4 and get better play? Thank you." Yeah. Little column A, little column B. The notebone is one of these lines that I believe objectively are probably quite pleasant for white, but I never felt it's worth to put in the work compared to the ratio with which you get them. on the board, so I normally avoid them. With white, it's a very sharp position after knight bd7. As far as I know, the critical move at the moment is knight d2. Preparing to either go f4, grabbing more space in the center with e4, or sometimes just to go f3, restrict this bishop. Knight d2 also directly against knight e4 or bishop e4. I believe the main line here is queen c7, bishop to c2. When it's supposed to that after e5, d5, white is better because he's controlling these passed pawns and he can push with f4 at an opportune moment. And I think black should probably not go d5, but something else here, rook d8 or whatever. With, yeah, very unbalanced position. I believe white is slightly better, but I'm not an expert. So yeah, with white, I normally find one way or another to avoid this. One sharp way to avoid this is to go knight c3, c6, e4, so-called martial whatever attack, which is quite dangerous for black. Sometimes I'll do this. Another way to avoid this, which is more positional, is knight f3, c6, queen c2, just defending the pawn and intending to follow up with bishop g5. I think this is playable. But while I'm talking about it, this very week Sopiko Guramishvili was here in Hamburg in our studio and was recording a video series on this very position, on the triangle with knight f c6, e6, and on the notebone. So you might want to check out her series once it comes out there. You're going to get a lot more detail. As for me, I believe knight c3. I believe white is supposed to be a little better after d takes c4, but I never felt it was worth the effort to learn it because I can go queen c2 with very little effort and get a perfectly playable position, while knight c3, dc4 is just not common enough for me to go there. But I believe, yeah, what I've told you earlier, that these lines are very sharp but slightly better for white. I haven't seen Sopiko's video series yet. She might argue something else and maybe convince me, because as I said, I'm not an expert. Check out her series. Achethista 3000. I don't know why I mispronounced both 3000 and Achethista, but that's what happened. Anyway, he's a FIDE master who's saying, I've recently been experiencing some problems against the Stonewall Dutch. Which line do you think is the best against it? Thanks in advance. As usual, I think avoid it. I don't want to allow them to play any opening, really. If someone is threatening to play the Dutch, I tend to play the Stonewall, I tend to go knight f3, f5, c4, knight f6. And the difference is now, if they want to play the Stonewall, they're going to end up in some trouble, because white hasn't played d4 yet. And there is all these very powerful systems of going d3, followed by e4. This is just good for white, so black can't really play the Stonewall against that move order, and that's what I normally do, because I'm too lazy to look at these positions in detail. They're clearly playable for black. Magnus Carlsen has played them a couple times, and I changed my mind about what's best. I think Avrukh gave something with knight c3, followed by rook b1 and b4. Very sharp play, that's interesting. The old days I was doing something like queen c2, castles. What was it? Was I going 95 here? I wish I could remember anything. I think I wanted some early knight e5, but I'm not sure. I might be mixing up the move order. You see, I'm really not much of an expert. No, I think it's b3. I know, b3 they go queen e7. No, I got it. Only took us 5 minutes. b3 they go queen e7 to stop bishop a3. And now knight e5. I was doing stuff like this, and the point was I always considered the plan with b6, bishop b7 best. b6, now you take and go knight to c4 and try to claim a tiny advantage because you grab this bishop. So yeah, I think that's what I was doing, but mainly I'm trying to avoid it, and I'm not very updated on it. Hope that helped. Lord Flashheart. What's he saying? Hi Jan, I'm rather curious about two similar variations and their differences. The first is the, what do we call this, the semitarash and the lesser plate. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop g7, cd, knight d5, bishop e7, queen e7. Similarities are obvious, but is the second really that inferior? And if so, why? Whoever said it's inferior? I think the second is superior, frankly. And I think most strong players would agree with that. The reason that most strong players play the first variation and not the second is that you don't get the second variation very often because it's a bunch of sidelines that white has to play in order to get there. But let me get a board to explain myself. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, which, as I said, is a favorite to feature in part 3 of my video series in the repertoire against d4. cd5, here knight d5 is playable. I might have done it myself once or twice, but it's a little shaky, and if I did this for the series, I'd certainly go ed5. Here, after e4, knight c3, bc, c5, white can get the main line of the semi-tarrasch with knight f3, which is slightly better for white, but black has good chances of defending. Or he could play a different move like rook b1 or even a3 directly against bishop b4 check, with chances for an advantage. And if they go bishop g5, which repertoire-wise, yeah, is a bit of a problem for me, bishop e7, bishop g5, first of all, not the most popular move in this position. Here, 90% of white players would play e3, transposing to whatever normal line of the Queen's Gambit declines out of the castles, h6 and so on. When cd5, I would certainly go knight takes d5 here, if given the chance. Second. Here we go. Because, in general, this should ease black's defense. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. I think my little board here just froze, not sure why. It's not accepting any more moves from me, which is sad. I might have to restart it, because else we have to go all blindfold. But anyway, I think this is fine for black, and you can certainly play it while I'm quietly switching to full screen here, hoping no one notices, and I'm trying to restart my little software, which I might have asked too much of. Poor software. This can only take hours. You're used to the drill. How much time do we have, by the way? There's still some time. There is still a little time. Are we there? We're almost there. Here we are. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7. I once had a game with something like e3, castles. Maybe I played h6 first and now cd5. And here I was extremely happy to go knight takes d5 because white had already committed to e3 as well. The immediate cd5, it's a little more challenging. And yeah, it's a closer choice between knight d5 and ed5. But I believe this is fine for black. Don't see why not. The main line is something, or what white normally tries to do, is to do without e3 here. Play something like, I think they start with rook c1 in order to be able to recapture with the rook here. Rook c1, castles, knight f3, stuff like this. And here black has a bunch of options. The one I like best is to just capture here. Rook takes and knight to c6, intending to go e5 very quickly. And I think black is fine. So yeah, I think it's a fully playable line, and the reason it's not more popular is that white players don't go here very often. Pretty much everybody plays cd5 or knight f3 in this position. And after bishop g5, bishop e7, pretty much everybody plays e3. It's very rare that someone wants to play this cult spot and waits for a move to then go for it. So yeah, I believe your line is perfectly fine. What else do we have? Michailm has a question. Hiya, I really like your new video series for black against 1d4. I'm glad you do. And I wonder how to get some interesting positions in this line. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, cd5. Yeah, I'm gonna cover that in one of the later parts. How play this against weaker player. That's always the main question asked when in the new video series against d4, the Vienna is a good opening, but it's very hard to generate like winning chances in the main lines as well if weaker player knows everything, what he's doing. So yeah, I'm always slightly arguing against this irrational fear. Pretty much everyone has, oh my god, I'm playing weaker player, but he might know all the theory or the resulting structure perfectly and I won't get winning chances. I'd be quite confident to get winning chances in your line against weaker player, but that's exactly what you're asking. So I don't know, normally players are weaker because they make weaker moves and you exploit those. So that's a tricky one, but let me briefly explain the main difference here between knight f3, d5, cd5, which is harmless, and knight c3, d5, cd5, which is a full-fledged mainline. The reason is that after knight f3, d5, cd5, ed5, white is not really in time to stop black from developing his bishop. Let's say he goes knight c3, which is normal, c6, goes bishop g5, which is normal, bishop e7, and now if e3, black is in time to go bishop f5. You gotta be careful here about queen b3 stuff, but here it can be very comfortably met with queen b6. And I'll give you that these positions aren't the most exciting, but there is still more than enough play, in my opinion, to beat the weaker player, because the structure is actually unbalanced. And there's some nice model games here. I'm going to include probably some in my next series where black does get his kingside attack rolling and wins some games, like Nikolic Kramnik is a prime example. But theoretically, this is totally fine for black without the dark squared bishops. Why would white have anything? And white can't really stop that. If he tries to stop it here with queen c2, for example, now black once again has in time to go g6, followed by bishop f5. Doesn't really change the situation. And therefore, in this move order, it's considered to be pretty harmless. There's a bit of theory here and there, but nothing to really worry about. Like queen c2, g6, e4 is a line we have to know, but it's fine for black. While if white starts with knight c3, then after d5, cd, ed, he is on time to make it at the very least harder for black to go bishop f5. After c6, e3, bishop f5 is an interesting line, but white has to move queen f3, which disrupts stuff a little bit. I still think it's fine for black, but certainly not a walk in the park. And white can also go queen c2 here, the main difference being that if black tries to go g6, e3, bishop f5, now he's not quite in time to meet queen b3 with queen b6. Well, with knight f3, bishop e7 included, this guy's defended, and queen b6 would be good, but this is unpleasant for black. So, long story short, knight f3 combined with cd5 is harmless. Of course, white is not worse, but nothing to worry about, while knight c3, d5, cd5 is one of the very main lines. I hope that helped. As for the weaker player stuff, yeah, just beat the weaker players because they're weaker. No reason to avoid that position. There's still plenty of play, in my opinion. Moriarty is asking, hi Jan, I have a question about a line of the English opening covered by Niklas Huschenbeet in his video series. Yep. Knight c3, e6, g3, one of the main lines. I'll remove 5 instead of knight c3. White could play g3. This was not mentioned in either the video or the ebook. Does this make any difference, and how should black proceed here? Yeah, this is an important line. I'm not sure if Niklas has advised some different move order or why it's not in there. But yeah, this is a part of the repertoire. I'll check with him, but I will answer your question because this is a very relevant line. Good news is I know the answer. Not sure if this is the move order, but yeah. As you mentioned, knight c3, e6, followed by g3, queen b6, we talked about earlier, is fine. And g3 would be nice for white if black had to play e6, bishop g2, queen b6. Here there's some extra options, like knight b5, where bishop g2 is more useful than knight c3. The problem with g3 is supposed to be the move e5. This has been the understanding since, I believe, the game Kramnik-Grischuk, where Grischuk had prepared this for the candidates tournament a couple of years ago. And here I think black is okay. It leads to a sharp play, and you have to do some work here. e5, knight b5, bishop b4 check. And one point is that bishop d2 can be met with a6, and white is not in time to go knight d6 check. So it leads to messy positions like this one. There's a recent game, Vallejo Leco maybe, some stuff like this, queen a5 check, knight d2, knight e4, which is a mess, but black is supposed to be alright here. And if white doesn't go knight bishop d2, but let's say knight c3, then black is in time to go d5. Well, some games and stuff like this as well, but it's all considered to be fairly harmless. Same can be said about knight c3 when I wish I could remember the move order. I think you're supposed to castle and after a3 to take and go d6. And black was mobilizing very, very quickly with bishop e6, attacking this pawn and then following up with d5. I'm not sure if I messed up the move order here. Maybe you're supposed to start with d6. Now that I think about it, I think you're actually supposed to start with d6. But long story short, the key difference is after g3, e5 is supposed to be a good move, while after knight c3, e5 is supposed to be a bad move, because here after knight db5 you don't have this bishop b4 check play. And yeah, that's important, so check that line out. What else we got? Passion, International Master Passion is saying, I notice a lot strong jams are playing the London system. Yeah, it's getting there from time to time. I was wondering after d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, c5, c3, knight c6, we tend to see cd, ed, bishop f5 instead of the immediate bishop f5. Maybe it's just my style speaking, but after cd, ed, bishop f5, knight f3, e6, queen b3, queen c8, I think white's position is easier to play. If you have something good in mind for white after bishop f5, it would be nice to know where black should look for full equality. And I think the line you're giving is fine for black, both of them. And I've asked myself the same question. Why don't they go bishop f5 immediately? London system, yeah, it's becoming more popular. People are just expanding the playing field by computerizing stuff that was normally only left to lazy guys who want to go for e3, c3 against anything, and they've started playing knight d2 because knight f3, queen b6 is fine. And yeah, let's get to both of these points. First of all, I think this is fine for black. How does the line go? Something like this. Knight f3, e6, knight h4, and black is supposed to play bishop e4, which is the game Carlsen-Wojtaszek. Knight takes, bishop d3, bishop d6. Nothing better than takes. And, well, white is fine, but so is black, I believe. Objectively, this is pretty equal with only good minor pieces left for black. Wojtaszek went on to castle queenside and lost a very sharp game, but I think you can play more conservatively and go here. Still, I'm not going to argue, maybe it is easier to play for white. And I believe that bishop f5 immediately is a playable move. dc5 is not really a threat because of e5. So what they normally do is either queen b3, but then black can go queen d7, knight f3, c4, queen d1 back. And this position occurred a bunch of times, but I don't believe that black can be in trouble here. Not sure if he's better, but he's certainly fine. If he goes e6, bishop d6, whatever. Okay, let's start with b5. Yeah, I think this is more or less equal, so no problems there. So I wasn't quite sure what they have in mind after bishop f5 immediately. I guess it's knight f3 anyway, when black has a choice between queen b6, which is interesting, or e6, queen b3, and queen c8, which also struck me as quite playable. So I don't know what the problem with bishop f5 is. It looked alright to me, and so did cd, ed, bishop f5. Sure, we're going to get some more games there, but I don't think it's a very critical attempt at black's life. It's just the world-class players are getting bored of all the main lines, and especially in rapid tournaments, they try to surprise their opponents with this stuff. That's why we've seen a lot of Kramnik, Grishuk, Carlsen doing it in the World Rapid and World Blitz, but I'm not too concerned. I'm sure they would crush me, but it wouldn't be because of bishop f4, is what I'm saying. Sean Stern is saying, hello Jan, my question has to do with the position arising after knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, c4, e6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles d4, c6. closed Catalan. After this position arises, I simply have no idea what to do here. Do you have any recommendation as to what to play in this position? Yeah, I've also struggled a bit over the years with understanding that sort of closed Catalan. I know that is supposed to be a good version for white, so I'm not really that worried about it. But since I don't do it with black and I don't do it with white, I'm not very booked up there. Let's have a look at it though. Not sure which move order. Here we are. Which move order you chose? I have this one. E6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles d4. In part 1 of my excellent series as a black repertoire against d4, I gave dc4 here, which is the main move, and considered to be a better move. Positions after c6 are considered slightly dodgy. They're more popular if with a different move order. Black earlier went bishop b4 check, and after bishop d2 went back, because here white is supposed to be a little better as far as I know. Main line is queen c2. Another line I have a bit of sympathy for is knight c3, intending to go queen d3 and e4 quite early. But yeah, the main line is something like queen c2, and if knight bd7, I don't really know my way around here. Frankly, I've never studied in much detail. But to go knight d2 and push e4 quickly, I believe white is supposed to be a little better, but I sort of hear you. I also don't really know what to do. Like, these positions, they sort of bore me and annoy me at the same time. But here, b6, e4 is supposed to be a little better for white. Bishop b7, e5, you get a nice space advantage. And in this French structure, the black counterplay is not very far advanced on the queen side, so I believe it's a little better for white. And else, after b6, e4, d takes e4, black very often has to suffer in such a position. This is what you often get against slightly less experienced players. They play like this with black, but normally you have to suffer. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not really a big expert at all. I believe white is supposed to be better with both knight c3 and queen c2, and that's why black shouldn't play c6 but dc4. But I hear ya, it's a strange position, and I don't even like thinking about it. What else we got? I'm a Jedi is saying, hi Jan, I'm a long-time subscriber who watched every opening clinic. Oof, painful. Watch Making a Murderer. As they are all awesome. Thank you, sir. I have never asked a question. He's been working on his tactics. And so he's trying to make up for it by asking like 7 different questions. But in general, I think, yeah, you're worried about bishop c4 in the Sicilian. And the short answer is don't. It doesn't make a lot of sense most of the time. But yeah, you're giving a couple different move orders. Let's briefly look at them. What's an aggressive way to meet this type of setup? I don't know. Like, I don't really think an aggressive and passive. I just try to make good moves, as dumb as it sounds, but there's no such thing as this type of setup. Like, every position you've given is very, very different. So let's do a very brief tour. As a rule, bishop c4 is not very dangerous against the Sicilian. Like in this position, for example, after e4, c5, bishop c4, it doesn't really make any sense. Black just goes e6, threatening d5. And for example, after knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, once again threatening d5. Black is already doing extremely well. One key trick is often that e5 can be met with d5 anyway. And yeah, it's not a good line. And the same can be said, I think there was some line with a3, which I don't even understand, frankly. As long, yeah, as black is ready to meet this with e6 and d5, there's no real problem. Then there was a line with c3, d6. First of all, why play d6 here? Play knight f6 or d5. But d6, d4, knight f6, bishop c4, which I've never seen in my life, also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think you can just take here if you want to. So often there's some tactics like this, but once the dust settles, black is better, and this is no exception. Here, I'll just take on d4, and black is fine. So Yeah, in general, bishop c4 is not very good against the Sicilian. One line that makes sense is knight f3, d6. Only after black played d6 is a similar story to what we've seen earlier. There is some justification to playing bishop c4, and this is the one playable line out of the ones you gave. And now with the intention of playing d3, c3, bishop to b3, knight bd2, short castles, play some sort of Italian setup against the Sicilian, as strange as it sounds. This is playable, and here black should know a little something, not much. He should go knight c6, threatening knight a5 often. So, no, actually that's not true. c3, a6, this is a key move, and that's the one threatening knight a5. Grabbing this bishop, which is also a typical idea after having stopped bishop b5 check. So this bishop has to move bishop b3. Here I believe it's best, and this is a bit of an exception, to put this bishop outside of the pawn chain, go bishop g4, and then follow up with e6, bishop e7, d5 at an opportune moment, and black has a very good game. But this is still the only respectable of all these bishop c4 lines. All the others, they really don't make a lot of sense, and I would not lose any sleep over them. I'm sure there's more pressing issues. So yeah, hope that helped, but in general, don't worry about it. It's not a good way to meet the Sicilian, and you always have e6 blocking this diagonal, so this bishop doesn't do much, then d5 kicking it. It's very different to e4, e5, where this is a natural square. Hope that helped a little bit. Cheze is saying, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Cheze? What do you think of the double queen's gambit d4, d5, c4, c5? Do you have any experience with this setup? Nah. It is very surprising for me that it is almost unknown. Is there any easy line for white to refute it? No, it's not as bad as it looks. It's not great, I would guess, but I don't think it's losing or terrible. So it has this shock factor that it looks ridiculous, but it's not that ridiculous. I believe white is better in a couple of ways. The way to punish it, or to try to punish it, is cg5, when after queen d5, knight to f3, c takes d4. White has a little Zwischenzug, knight c3, winning an extra tempo. And black normally goes queen a5, knight takes d4. What do they do? Knight f6, I guess. Yeah. And this position is sort of playable for black. Mamedyarov had it a couple times. I believe white is better after g3, e5, knight b3, but it's not that easy. So you can, it's one of these lines which you can play without knowing a whole lot, and the price you pay is you are slightly worse in a couple of ways, but you save yourself learning a lot of theory. And the other move, which is the most common one and a more common position, because you quite often get this via this move order, where c5 is a little more established, c4 is also better for white. Here black has a choice between dc4, which after e3 or d5 is a theoretical position of the queen's gambit accepted, or the same c4, cd4, cd5, when queen d5 transposes to what we just saw after knight c3. And knight f6 is one of these lines after queen takes d4, queen takes d5, knight c3, where maybe black can hold, but Svidler had a very unpleasant experience with it, for example, in the World Cup final against Kayakin, where he lost a key game in this stuff, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken, but I think it was this. So it's maybe playable, but it's not a walk in the park for black, and I would probably not do it, but it's not as bad as it looks, if that helps. The next question. By the way, I've mentioned this a couple times, but there's no need to ask questions in the chat for these shows, because I really have my hands full getting through the questions that are posted in the news article. So I'm trying to make it through those. And yeah, I have to apologize. I can't answer questions in the chat. Y is saying, hi Jan, how to play solid against the Blackmar-Diemer gambit? Once again, I'm not 100% sure what the Blackmar-Diemer gambit is, but I'm very bad with opening names, so it always helps me if you give me the actual position, but I will make an educated guess. I believe Blackmar-Diemer gambit is this stuff, right? d4, d5, e4. I don't know. c6 looks very solid. The Caro-Kann, or e6, the French, if you're very concerned about it. I'd take the pawn. It's a pawn. Knight f6. And what do? f3, right? f3. I take that one. Here, I believe there's a couple decent systems. I'm trying to remember which move order I liked. I thought c6 was good, for example, I believe. And if bishop c4, go bishop f5. One key trick is not to blunder bishop g4, bishop f7. But if you go bishop f5, castles e6, then there's one more trick, knight e5, not to blunder, knight takes f7 followed by rook f5, or rook f5 followed by knight f7. But if you make it all the way here and you find bishop g6, then you can start developing the pieces and enjoying your extra pawn, knight bd7, bishop e7, whatever. So yeah, I think this c6 followed by bishop f5 was quite clever. I'm not 100% sure which move order I like better, bishop f5 followed by c6 or the other way around, but I think I wanted this. And here, I don't know, I guess they have other tries, but they don't look very serious. Knight bd7. I don't know, I'm not a big fan, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear, but if it really bothers you, then yeah, go c6 or e6. Nah, not really. Take the pawn. If white gives the pawn a move too, that's a very generous offer, and you could argue that e4 is the second worst move in this position after bishop h6. I'm not sure g4 must be worse as well. I'm not sure I'd go that far. I don't think it's that terrible, but grab the pawn. It's very generous to give you a pawn on move 2. What else we got? And how much time we got? I'll do like 10-15 more minutes. I hope to get through with it. Portis2 is asking, what line do you recommend with white against Queen's Gambit accepted? Very general question. Depends on your tastes and the amount of time you want to invest. I've mentioned earlier that I think objectively the most critical move is e4, but yeah, you gotta put some work in. I've seen a question somewhere, which I'm not sure where it was, but I will combine it, about knight c6 here, so I'll talk about that a bit more. Well, the best way to play was here, knight f3, bishop g4. I believe white is better here after bishop takes c4. I've recently had a game here, and I think it's unpleasant for black, e6, d5. Leading to a small but stable white plus. My game was something like this. And here queen d7 was played, e d5 is better, but white is still a little better after queen b5 check. So against knight c6, I think knight f3, bishop c4 is quite pleasant. And the main lines, yeah, I've talked about e5 earlier. Here you have to be booked up, knight f6. The other main line is knight f6, e5, knight d5, bishop takes c4, which should favor white because of the space advantage, but is also a well-known battleground for the world's best players, so things aren't that easy, but I quite like it for white after both bishop b3 and bishop d3. I believe it's quite pleasant. I'd probably go here, but I keep changing my opinion on that and develop the pieces. But yeah, it's a matter of taste. You can also absolutely go knight f3 followed by e3 or e3 immediately, but the most critical is e4, so that's, I believe, the best move. Also the one that asks for the most work, unfortunately, which sometimes happens. Tam2 is asking, hi Jan, why is the Schliemann-Janisch-Ruy Lopez considered dubious? Thanks. Is it considered dubious? I see a lot of world-class players playing it. I don't think it's considered dubious at all. So yeah, it's not considered dubious. I don't play it because there's too many lines where I feel black has to be precise to make a draw. Like this goes, oops, sorry, I have the wrong screen. You can see all my secret analysis up there. Where there's too many lines where black has to be precise to make a draw, which goes for every opening if you go deep enough. But yeah, I don't know, stuff like this. And this is not even the main line. Knight takes f6, queen e2 is arguably more critical, but here white wins a pawn and black has to be careful to get enough compensation, which he's supposed to get after like bishop e7 and take on c6, but it's not that easy, and I'm not even sure what the most critical try is nowadays. I think they alternate between bishop c6 followed by queen e2 or knight c3 and this move d3, which, yeah, there's always some games. Either knight f6 immediately or takes, knight f6. Queen d3 was fashionable for a while. So no, I don't think it's considered to be overly dubious. I think it's a playable line. And a lot of strong players play it. So, nah, it's not dubious, it's playable. What else we got? Gior is... yeah, that's a question I was talking about earlier, which I hope I already answered. A lot of interest in the Queen's Gambit accepted today. e4, knight c6. Yeah, go knight f3, bishop g4, bishop takes c4. Kalashnikov is saying, "Hi Jan, I would like to play Grunfeld style with white. What can I play against all these d5, knight f6, bishop g4, c6 systems?" First, a general point, you can't really play Grunfeld style with white. Like, I understand what you mean. You want to go knight f3, d5, g3, and then hope that black goes c5, bishop g2, knight c6, when you want to go d4. But it's going to be like 1% of your games where black goes d5, c5, knight c6, if that highly. Like, most black players won't go there, and you're going to be dealing with a lot of these... Oops, sorry. With a lot of these annoying bishop g4 systems or one of the thousands of other systems. I'm not saying it's not a good opening to play knight f3, d5, g3, or knight f3, followed by g3 in general. A lot of fantastically strong players do it. It's arguably Kramnik's main line nowadays. But the belief that you're gonna get the Grunfeld a tempo up is, yeah, it's unlikely to happen. And even that line is not that great for white, but that's a different story. Most people avoid it. So, yeah, you have to deal with g6 here, with knight f6 followed by e6 and bishop e7, and with a lot of c6, bishop g4 systems. I don't really have an answer for you. There's a huge body of theory for all of these things, and it's very move order dependent and preference dependent. Do you want to play with an early c4? Do you want to play some sort of King's Indian attack with d3, knight bd2, castles, queen e1 and e4? It's a huge, huge body of different positions, and honestly, I don't know. I've never done it with white. I've never been that attracted to it. I've noticed that they've started playing all kinds of early c4s in positions where it used to be considered dubious, like this one. They start playing early c4, but I'm sorry, I can't really help you very much there, because I don't know, and I would need a more specific line, because there's big differences between everything, between bishop g4 here immediately, c6 followed by bishop g4, knight f6 followed by bishop g4. It's tough, but mainly, if you want to play this complex, it's fine, but don't do it because you want to play Grunfeld style with white, because you're not going to get a lot of Grunfelds. Tomek 188. I'm going to have to call it a day soon. I got to get going, so I'll rush through as many questions as I can. Is saying, Jan, what is your opinion on this line against Spanish opening? a6, bishop a4, knight g7, c3, g6, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I've looked at it a couple times trying to find something a little spicy, but as it often happens, I didn't like it, and I've never played it, and I probably won't. It's not bad. Like, at some point, a lot of the world's best players played it, and it's certainly a viable line to create unbalance and some tension. I believe you've been a little generous with the move order, though, including short castles and bishop g7, when the critical try for white is to go d4 here immediately, which makes black's life a little harder. You can go d5, but slightly worse for black. If you go b5, white has this annoying move, bishop c2. Once again, d5 is possible, but slightly worse. Bishop c2, bishop g7, and d5, which is unpleasant as far as I know. Now knight a5, bishop to d2 is supposed to be a problem, and that only works because castles is not included yet, and stuff like this is, as far as I know, very dangerous. Here, knight to c3, and this king feels a little left alone. So, not a fan, but it's playable and leads to unbalanced positions. I don't like it that much. And the move order you've given, as I mentioned, that's a better version for black after bishop b3, d6. I think this is quite playable, but white can do better than that. Dr. Buki is saying, "Hi Jan, in your excellent, thank you, video series against the Nimzo, you recommend the line castles knight f3, d5, cd, ed, bishop f4, and after c5, dc5. I've seen queen a5 recommended against this, with the idea e3, bishop f5, or knight a6. What is your opinion? Great new video series on the Vienna. Thanks." Thank you. Yeah, I've looked at this after seeing your question. This, oops. See, it's starting to get late. I'm starting to mess up which screen I'm supposed to go to constantly. And yeah, I have to concede that queen a5, which I think I hadn't covered in my series, I can't remember much, but is a pretty good move. Castles, knight f3, d5, cd, ed, bishop f4, c5, dc, queen a5. I've tried to refute it in, yeah, the very limited time I've had to prepare for this question. That didn't really succeed. Normally you don't want to go e3 here. e3 is a natural move, but to punish these early queen a5, bishop b4 expeditions, it's quite often an idea to retreat this bishop and try to capture the bishop pair. So that's where I started looking, but it looked like black is probably in time to get in some early d4 and simplify. Like if white manages to get in a3, rook c1, recapture on c3 with the bishop, he tends to be better, but I'm not quite sure you get there if black plays aggressively with bishop g4. And here I've tried around a bit and my opinion isn't fully formed, but it looked like black was sort of holding after bishop e2 or bishop d3. So it's not a stupid idea. Rook c1 is another plausible move, threatening a3, but the problem with rook c1 is that queen takes a2. Seems to work. Then e3, knight e4, and my computer was giving a small edge for white, but I don't really believe it. I think this is fine for black. And yeah, I'd have to investigate a little further, especially this move bishop d2. I wasn't quite done with my studies, and that's the direction I would lean towards, but it's certainly a very decent idea, and apologies for not having come up with it myself. This bishop f4, yeah, was a bit of a surprise line, and I think it has value as a surprise weapon, but I wouldn't be surprised if people found an antidote. And this might be it. I need more time. For now, bishop d2 is the move I'd focus on, but I'm not sure it promises an advantage. Never mind. Okay, this really last two questions. I gotta get going. Got stuff to do. Hi Jan, what is your take on the early queen sortie in the French Tarrasch? e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight ft7, f4, c5, knight f3, queen b6. Is it viable enough to be more than a surprise weapon? You need to give me more information, because in the position you're giving me, see, once again I switched to the wrong board. I'm losing it. Oops, sorry. In the position you're giving me after queen b6, as far as I know, the main move is bishop e3, and here knight c6 transposes to pretty much a main line after knight a4, queen a5, c3. So it's not much of a surprise weapon, but it's playable for black as far as I know. C takes d, b4, queen c7 here, knight takes d4 and a6 or whatnot. Supposed to be a playable line, so not against it, but I'm not sure what you have in mind against bishop b3, because as far as I know, queen takes b2 doesn't really work here because of knight b5. So I thought the best black has is to transpose to the normal line with knight c6 anyway. So I'm not sure how surprising it is, but it can't be too bad. Thule. Oof, the Winaver. Hi Jan, what do you think about the French variation e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop e4, e5, and so on and so forth. The very sharp we never. Has black enough compensation for the pawn? This is one of the sharpest lines out there, and yeah, I don't think anybody really knows if black has enough compensation for the pawn. It's a line that's not that popular at top level, but I've never played it or analyzed it with either color, so I do seriously lack expertise. Still, I do have my usual theory nerd education, and what I can tell you is that, okay, move forward, that doesn't matter, that however we get here. In this position, bishop d7 is not supposed to be the critical move. The critical move nowadays is d takes c3 immediately, intending to meet queen d3 with d4, which is very messy, but that's the latest word of theory. After bishop d7, queen d3, d takes c. Many moves are supposed to be better for white, as far as I know, including knight takes c3 and bishop e3. So it's a total mess, and I'm not gonna give any general plans like queen your h-pawn and feet off the attack. It's chaos, and I've never analyzed it properly, but I know this is considered to be better for white, while the big discussion is d takes c, queen d3, d4, which might be a little better for white, but this is the real question at the moment. Okay, I'll do one more, but I really gotta go. Der Ruffi. I think I've more or less answered this. Yeah, I think I've more or less answered this question earlier. Fg7, rook g8 is better for white, which is why I avoid that variation. And I would go for bishop takes d4, not e takes d4, in order not to end up there. Like I've mentioned, I don't know this stuff very deeply, but this always looked unpleasant to me. Bishop g5, bishop e7, rook e1, and maybe there is a way to equalize, I don't know it, therefore I would go bishop takes d4 when I don't know a way for white to equalize, which is better than not knowing a way for black to equalize in my book. Okay. One more, but yeah, you can see I'm rushing through the questions, but I think this is the last one that I had on my list, so I've made it through all of them that were posted before the show, which is a big success, so I'll do that one as well. Paco Vela 12, and apologize to everybody else who's posted the questions later when I was already setting up the show. I hope it weren't many. Paco Vela 12 is asking, hello Jan, I play the French with black, and lately I've been playing this bishop t7, bishop b5 system when allowed. Sometimes white plays a4 to prevent it, but I just go back to normal with knight c6. Yeah, a4 no good. However, I want to be prepared against the best white option, which seems to be allowing black to go bishop b5, exchange bishops there, and then use white's better development to attack on the king side. I'm very interested on what you have to say about this system. No book covers this so far. What do you think? Yeah, I think it's not great. But let me explain myself. Once again, the French is a little outside my realm of expertise, but there is good reasons why the main lines are knight c6, knight f3, bishop d7, or knight g7, or queen b6, or even f6 if you're brazen. So I know this plan looks very appealing strategically. You want to exchange the bad bishop and thereby solve your problems, but I think there's a direct sort of problem if white goes bishop d3 here, which is the best move. Now, most strong players go c takes d4, but then white goes knight takes d4, avoids your bishop b5 option, and after bishop c5, this pawn sacrifice with castles is very dangerous for black, as far as I know. So they normally go knight c6, or often go knight c6, but this position, yeah, you haven't managed to exchange this bishop, and I believe white is a little better. So I'm assuming your idea is to play bishop b5 immediately. But here, as far as I know, this d takes c5 is very dangerous for black. Bishop takes c5 and b4. This is a key tactic. Black can't take on f2 because of king e2. This bishop will get trapped. And it doesn't really have a great square to go. Normally they go to f8 back to keep the e7 square for the knight and defend this pawn. Or let's say they take first and now they go bishop f8. But this position, strategically, it's still nice for black if black would manage to get all his pieces out. But I'm not sure he will after there's many dangerous plans. Even the immediate knight to a3 strikes me as quite dangerous, intending bishop e3, short castles, and then opening the position with c4. But even the more circumspect castles, once again, intending to do something like, I don't know, rook e1, knight a3, bishop e3, and c4. I don't think black is going to be in time to finish his development before white opens the position. And I think that's the reason why this line with bishop d7, queen b6 is not very popular and people go for knight c6 setups. So sorry to disappoint you. I know it's tempting the first time you see it, and I might be wrong. Like, I'm sure these positions I was giving, if you're very well prepared here, you can survive or make a case for it, but I don't think it's needed because most of the main lines against the advanced French are good. And this is one that strikes me as very, very dangerous for black. So that's it. That's the last question I had on my list. And we're slightly over time. Thank you guys for watching. I hoped I could help out one or two of you. I hope I didn't insult everybody with my usual condescending, play the main lines, don't play this crap answer. And yeah, I like doing these shows because they also help me looking at some fresh lines and staying a bit in tune with theory. I'll be busy for a while starting the Vaikens coverage, which starts on Saturday, day after tomorrow. Tomorrow, I believe we have a Banter Blitz scheduled before that to warm up. And then please, feel free to tune in to watch the live coverage of Vaikens with Magnus Carlsen, with Anish Giri, with a lot of good guys, and Luke van Vele. Special greetings to Luke, starting on Saturday. Thanks for watching. Go premium if you haven't yet. In order to ask me questions, to play me in Banter Blitz, to do all the good stuff, check out my new video series. And I'll see you guys tomorrow or the day after or at some point. Enjoy your evening, everybody. Bye-bye.